It's Professor Undak, and I'm going to narrate this PowerPoint. This is the material that we went over on Wednesday at our office hour / discussion time. So if you want to listen to our discussion of the second set of discussion questions, you can go to the Confer Zoom button on our Canvas website, and it'll take you to Confer Zoom, and there's a link there where you can check out recorded, I think it's called recorded meetings, and then you can listen to this meeting. I'm going to try to remember to record all of our sessions. I think there were 10 or 12 of us there on Wednesday, so this is what we talked about. Last time we talked about the state of nature, what the state of nature would look like, and how property could be started to be developed in the state of nature, and how the state of nature has this law of nature that could guide everybody's behavior. Don't harm others and help them when you can. But Locke recognizes that the state of nature, even though he doesn't think it's a state of war, he thinks that people actually could live without government. It just wouldn't. It would suck, and they wouldn't want to do it for very long. But he recognizes these flaws in the state of nature, and they're going to correspond to the three functions of government that exist in all governments. And so this is how he gets there. He says that there's a law of nature that governs our behavior, and most people because people are rational, most people will try to follow the law of nature, be willing to not harm other people and to help other people when they can. But it's not going to work for everybody, because some people won't follow the law of nature. We know that some people don't follow the law, even though it's very clearly written down. So just telling people don't harm others isn't going to necessarily work in the state of nature, because some people are just going to say, that doesn't apply to me. I don't care. I don't care if I harm other people. I want what I want. And if somebody gets in my way, I'm going to, harm them or push them out to get what I want. So not everybody will follow the law of nature. I'm not a criminal justice major, but my understanding is that the estimates are that about 10% of the population will break the law, and knowingly break the law, and not necessarily care about people that they might hurt if they break the law. Like 90% of the people, well, you tell me to stop at a stop sign. Yeah, okay, I'll stop at a stop sign. You tell me not to break into people's houses and take their stuff. I won't break into people's houses and take their stuff. But there's a certain percentage of the population that will engage in harmful behaviors toward others, even when there's a consequence for it, right? And in the state of nature, the enforcement's going to be a lot more difficult. So not everybody's going to agree. So not everybody will follow the law of nature. But even more than that, not everybody will agree on what constitutes a harm, right? So if you listen to Democrats and Republicans, or liberals and conservatives debate what the law should cover and what the law shouldn't cover, you can see that even though we live in a civil society, we don't live in a state of nature, we still have debates about whether some behavior is harmful and should be regulated by the government, or whether that behavior is not harmful and shouldn't be regulated by the government. So think about debates that we have over abortion, over drug laws, over prostitution, over marriage, same-sex marriage, or polygamy, right? It's illegal to marry more than one person at the same time, but not everybody thinks that it should be. And some people think that that's a ridiculous law, that people should be able to engage in whatever kinds of consensual relationships they want with other people, as long as they're not, harming children or engaging in domestic abuse and that kind of stuff. So we have lots of different, lots of arguments about what constitutes harm. Think about what some religions say is harmful. There are some religions, for example, that think card playing is harmful, that they think dancing is harmful. They think you shouldn't be able to read certain kinds of books or listen to certain kinds of music. So not everybody would agree on what a harmful behavior is, even if everybody agreed that they wouldn't harm people, right? So you get this situation where, hey, you say it's harmful, I say it's not harmful. you don't have to do it. I'm free to do it because I don't think it's a harm. That brings us to the problems with enforcement that we actually talked about last time. Locke recognizes that since everybody in the state of nature is entitled to enforce the law of nature, that enforcement is going to become a problem. We're biased in our own favor. So if we are engaging in a behavior that harms others, chances are we're going to resent it if somebody tries to punish us for that behavior. Or if they try to punish somebody we like, we're going to want our friends to be able to get away with things that we don't want our enemies to be able to get away with. And so you end up with this situation where people start punishing each other out of revenge and out of getting even. You punished me too harshly, therefore I'm going to punish you. And now you punished me unfairly. And so now my family's going to punish your family. And then you get these endless cycles of punishment for revenge and vengeance, etc. The other problem with enforcement of the law of nature is that if the purpose of enforcing the law of nature is to provide justice to the people who are harmed, people who get harmed who can't enforce the law of nature themselves because of mental disabilities or physical disabilities, or they're unpopular and nobody will come to their aid, or they don't have a lot of friends or a lot of family around them, you end up with a situation where somebody potentially gets harmed, but then nobody enforces the law of nature, and so they don't get justice. And so we have a problem with enforcement in the state of nature. And then finally, there's no neutral judge to help resolve disputes. So the idea of the state of nature is everybody's going to follow the law of nature, but we know that disputes are going to arise either over whether somebody actually did the thing that they're accused of. You broke into my house and took my Xbox. Do people still play with Xboxes? I don't know. You took something that was important to me, my iPad or my laptop or something. And I say, I didn't do it. Who told you that I broke into your house? That wasn't me. I'm sorry that your laptop got stolen, but I didn't do it. Well, I heard that you did, and my friend says they saw you going into my house and taking my iPad, etc. So we could have disputes that would arise, and there's really no neutral judge to help us resolve those disputes. We could say, hey, let's let Joe across the street hear both sides of the story and then render a verdict. But that verdict wouldn't necessarily be unbiased, and also it wouldn't be binding, right? So Joe comes along and says, hey, I think the evidence is that you actually did break into that house and steal that iPad. And I'd be like, well, to hell with you and your judgment. I'm not going to allow myself to be punished for that. So there's no neutral judge to help us resolve disputes. So now the state of nature lacks the three things that make up any government. So it lacks a legislative branch. The job of the legislative branch, whether it's Congress or the California state legislature, is to decide what the law should be, what kinds of behaviors should be prohibited under the law. And the idea is that these laws are written down so that everybody knows what's expected of them, and they're accessible to people. So it's not secret what the law is and what the law covers and what the law doesn't cover. It's not a secret. And the idea here is that we need this so that we don't have to decide what harmful behavior is on our own. We can look to the law to say, look, you may disagree that drinking until you can't see straight and then getting in your car, you might not think that that's harmful, but the law says that it is. And so you shouldn't do that. And if you do it, there's going to be somebody in the executive branch who can enforce the law, whether you're capable of enforcing it yourself or whether you think that the law should be enforced against you or not. So the state of nature lacks an effective executive branch. So in most governments in the United States, the executive branch is the office of the presidency and the federal bureaucracy that is charged with carrying out the laws that are put in place by Congress. At the state level, it's the state legislature that is the legislative branch, and then the governor and the other agencies within the executive branch are charged with carrying out those laws. And at the local level, we have police and sheriff's officers who are charged with enforcing the law on behalf of the state at the local level as well. And so we need to have an executive branch. And then the other thing that the state of nature lacks, of course, is a judicial branch. And Locke believes that the judicial branch in particular should be separate from the other branches. It's not an illegitimate government if people choose to have a unified government where one group of people acts as the legislature, executive, and judicial branch. But Locke thinks that a separated system, a system of separated powers, is probably more rational for people who want to make sure their liberty is protected by the government. So he actually favors some separation of powers. And that you can see in the United States at our federal level, we've taken this notion of needing a neutral judge to heart because our judges serve for life and they're not subject to election. So a lot of countries have separation of powers. Some countries keep their legislative branch and executive branch together and separate out their judicial branch. So, for example, England is a parliament, right? The legislative branch and the executive branch are mingled together. So in England, they don't elect separately a prime minister. The prime minister gets to be prime minister because his or her party controls parliament. So the prime minister is actually a member of parliament who is prime minister by virtue of the fact that right now, Boris Johnson, his party controls most of the seats in the parliament. So we separate them out. Locke says there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but these are the things that every government needs: a legislative, executive, and judicial. And so Locke argues that even though the state of nature isn't a state of war, because there's no guarantee that we'll be able to hold on to the property that we acquire, we can't really be expected to exercise all of our liberty to acquire property, to do what we want to do to make ourselves happy, because it's going to be very uncertain. It's not a state of war, but it's not as good as it can be. And so rational people will agree to consent to be governed in exchange for the protection of their liberty to acquire property and to hold on to that property and to make society progress and to live happy lives, in theory. So we agree to give up our absolute liberty and equality, but we don't agree to give up all of it, right? Hobbes says, life in the state of nature is so bad that we should set up an absolute power to govern us, and we should be willing to give up all of our liberty to the government. Locke actually doesn't make that argument. He says we really only give up the power to do whatever we want because we're perfectly free in the state of nature. We agree to live under a set of laws, but he's going to argue that those laws should actually be limited in scope, that you really should reserve to the people quite a lot of liberty to make a lot of decisions for themselves about what kind of literature they read, about what kind of job they pursue, what kind of religion they practice or don't practice, those kinds of things. We also have to give up almost completely our power to enforce the law of nature. We give that up to the executive branch, and they in turn are supposed to enforce the law fairly to make sure that the laws that are passed by the government are followed by everybody and that there's punishment for people who break the law. We don't ever give up any of our rights, absolutely. We still have a right to self-preservation. And if we can't call the police, or if there's no time for the police to show up, we do still have the right to self-preservation, but we pretty much give up the general right of enforcement so that we don't have these vigilante groups out enforcing the law. We give that up to the government. We also give up some of our absolute liberty and equality for one specific purpose, and that's to protect our property. Hobbes argues that the purpose of government is to keep us safe. And so anything the government decides is necessary to keep us safe is a just thing for the government to do. Locke doesn't say that. Locke says, look, we only give the government this limited purpose, which is the preservation of our property, broadly speaking, our stuff and our families and our own lives. And other than that, we don't need the government to tell us what to do. We only need the government to protect our property so that we can go out and acquire lots of property and wealth and improve the society for everybody and make everybody happy. So he prefers the separation of powers. He thinks that that is one way to sort of limit the ability of the government to overstep its powers so that you have the legislative branch and the executive branch and the judicial branch somewhat separate from one another. And he calls for a very limited government. Some people think that Locke is a bit of a libertarian, that really he's calling for just enough laws to keep people safe in the sense that, not in the order sense that Hobbes talks about, although, of course, you're going to have some police and that kind of stuff. But really, he prefers a government that is really just providing enough guidance to keep commerce flowing, to keep wealth developing, and to keep provide people with the political environment in which they can exercise their liberty to the maximum amount, right? In the state of nature, you're 100% free, but you would only be able to exercise just a small portion of that freedom because there's no guarantee that you'll be kept, your property will be secure, etc. Ironically, I guess, for Locke, once we give up some freedom, if we set up the government property properly, we can actually exercise more freedom. So it's kind of a weird purpose of government, is to protect our liberty to acquire property and to hold on to that property. So Locke prefers this limited government, and he specifically calls for 4 sort of broad limits on the government exercising power. One, I just said, it's the power of the government should be limited to making laws that are related to protecting property. So if it's not related to protecting people's property, then the government shouldn't be allowed to legislate in that area. So, for example, literature, religion, the kind of music you listen to, the kind of food you eat, etc. Locke might, he doesn't say this, so we're just speculate about, Locke might not like, for example, minimum wage laws. He might think that there should definitely be laws that say if somebody hires you, they're obligated to pay you, but he might take issue with the government specifying how much a business has to pay employees. So if you're willing to work for a little bit less, why shouldn't you get the job? And if everybody demands a higher wage, then the businesses would be forced to pay a higher wage, or they wouldn't be able to get people to work for them. But he seems to think that a free market should be limited as little as possible. He doesn't specifically talk about wages and stuff, but he does think that the government's power to regulate the acquisition of property should be relatively limited, and that the government's responsibility is to guarantee that people will be able to hold on to their property and protect their property. And of course, property, broadly speaking, so we're going to need laws against physically harming people and abusing people and that kind of thing. He recognizes that there's a need for exceptions during times of crisis. He recognizes that during a time of crisis, a war or something like that, it might be rational to give the government power beyond the limited scope of government that we generally think that the government should be exercising. So, for example, Locke might, if he were alive today, he might say, this is a time in which it maybe is appropriate for the government to tell people to stay home and to tell businesses that they can't be open to the public unless they maintain social distancing and unless they're an essential business, etc., because it's a crisis. What Locke counsels us against, sorry, I forgot my word there for a minute. What Locke counsels us against is allowing that increased exercise of power to continue beyond the crisis. So we have to be careful about that we don't let the exercise of power become a sort of new normal where the government can tell us what to do beyond this sort of limited scope of power once things return to normal. That Locke argues then that exercise of power should also stop. And so we are arguing about this now, aren't we? When is this exercise of government power? When is it going to be appropriate for the government to lift those restrictions, and how burdensome is it legitimate for the government to be with its restrictions, and should it be left up to each individual state? Should there be a national policy, et cetera? We're having lots of debates about that in our politics right now. What Locke would say is, what you should probably keep in mind is to make sure that you don't, once that camel gets his nose under the power tent, that we don't allow that camel to hold on to that extra power that we're authorizing the government to institute because it's a time of crisis. We want to make sure that when the crisis is over, we go back to a more limited government where the government is not engaging in behaviors that Locke thinks go beyond protecting property for the common good. Locke also argues that the legislature must be forced to follow its own rules. This is because, in part, Locke argues that the legislative branch and the executive and the judicial, they're all part of the social contract. They come from the body of people who engage in the social contract. So they're still part of the social contract, and they have to be, everybody has to be treated the same under the law. So remember, Hobbes argues that the sovereign, whoever you give power to, is not part of the social contract. So the sovereign doesn't have to be treated equally with everybody else. The sovereign, because anything the sovereign does is just, the sovereign can never actually violate the social contract because justice is whatever the sovereign says it is. But Locke doesn't say that. Locke argues that the government actually is part of the social contract, and the government actually can violate the social contract and be unjust. And so one of the ways that Locke thinks that the legislature should be reined in is that they should have to follow their own rules. If they want to set minimum wage laws for businesses to follow, then they have to pay their staff a minimum wage. If they want to have worker safety laws, if they want to have sexual harassment laws on the books, they have to follow those laws themselves. And Locke thinks that that's one way of guaranteeing that the legislature won't pass bad laws. I mean, obviously it's a theory, not a guarantee. The laws also must not be arbitrary, right? The laws must all be related somehow to protecting property for the common good, and that the laws should not be passed in haste. They should not be just decrees from one day to the next. The law should be stable and understandable and knowable from one day to the next. An example of what we prohibit in our Constitution that's related sort of to what Locke is kind of alluding to in terms of arbitrary laws. The US Constitution prohibits what's called ex post facto laws, right? Laws that allow you to be punished for doing something that wasn't illegal when you did it. So we don't allow that. If the government decides that they're going to, so we made it, let's see, I think of an easy example. It's illegal in the state of California to talk on your cell phone while you are driving, unless you have a hands-free device. But the law, once that law was put into place, it can be enforced. It's not arbitrary anymore. It can be enforced from now on. But they wouldn't be allowed to just say, oh, and we know that everybody was driving with their phone in their hand before the law got passed. So if we have any evidence of that, we're going to go ahead and issue tickets to people who did this before we made it illegal. We don't allow those kinds of laws. And Locke implies that those kinds of laws would not, rational people would not give their government the power to pass those kinds of laws. The other thing that Locke says is that legitimate governments should not be allowed to take people's property without their consent. So there's two types of property that could be taken from you by the government. One is your actual physical property. Say you own a piece of property, you own a house, you own the land that a business is on, or you own the building that a business is in. That's your sort of physical property. The things that you buy with the money that you earn, et cetera, are your physical property. But also your Economic freedom in the form of taxes would be another way that the government could take your property without your consent. If you think of your wages and the earnings that you make as property, Locke says that legitimate governments should, rational people should never give the government the power to take their property without their consent. And the way we consent to have our property taken from us by the government in the form of taxation for the most part, but also eminent domain, if you think about building schools and building roads and stuff through people's private property. The way we consent to be governed and to have our property taxed is through elections. So Locke makes the argument that whatever body you create that you're going to give the power to tax to, and in most governments, that's the legislative branch's function, is to pass the laws, including tax laws. Those people need to be elected. So Locke calls for a republic. He calls for the establishment of a republic. He said you don't really have to elect your executive branch. You don't have to elect your judges. But rational people should insist that they be given an opportunity to elect the people who are going to make the laws that establish what percentage of their property has to be turned over to the government in the form of taxes. And that way, if the government taxes us too heavily, we have an option of voting in different people next time. So Locke thinks that the government should have these limits placed on their exercise of power. He thinks that rational people would do this so that the government is only passing laws that are directly related to protecting property and not going beyond the scope of that and sticking their noses in where they don't belong. And Locke argues, and this is what we're going to talk about next time, Locke argues that because the government is part of the social contract, and because people do have natural rights to liberty and property, it is possible for a government to be unjust. It is possible for the government to violate the rights of the people. And when the people feel that the government has violated their rights in a way that goes beyond what they're willing to tolerate, the people have a right to overthrow that government and to establish a new government. So he provides for a right to revolution. And the chapters that I asked you to read for Monday, which is when we'll have a discussion about the right to revolution, I think are some of the most interesting and fun parts of Locke's second treatise on government. And it gives us a lot of food for thought about whether or not the United States is susceptible to some of the things that Locke says might lead to revolution. And I'll just give you a hint. When you read the chapters on the dissolution of government or the right to revolution, Locke's going to make the argument that if there's a revolution, it's never the people's fault. It's always the government's fault when there's a revolution. If the government leaves the people with no option, then there's going to be a revolution. Hobbes argues that if there's a revolution, it's the people's fault because the government can't be unjust. Locke says the exact opposite. So we'll talk about that on Monday. Have a fantastic weekend.